This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. It was supposed to be just another routine ride, but from the moment that passenger got in my car, I knew something was off. Little did I know, it would be the most unnerving experience of my life as a rideshare driver, one that still haunts me to this day. I pulled up to the pickup spot, a nondescript corner in a quiet residential area. The guy who got in looked normal enough, mid-30s, casual clothes, nothing remarkable. But as soon as he settled into the back seat and I started driving, the weird questions began. Hey man, random thought, but have you ever wondered how easy it would be to just disappear? Like without a trace? He asked it so casually, like he was asking about the weather. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. Can't say I have. Why do you ask? He shrugged. No reason. It's just something I think about sometimes. How you could walk away from your life and start over. Erase yourself completely. I didn't know how to respond, so I just kept driving, following the GPS to the destination he'd entered. It was taking us further and further out of the city, down winding roads lined with dense forest on either side. The guy kept peppering me with these disconcerting questions the whole way. Do you think anyone would really try to find you? Or would they just assume you wanted to be gone? What's the most remote place you've ever been to? Somewhere no one else was around? I gave short, non-committal answers, growing more uneasy by the minute. I was relieved when the navigation finally announced we were approaching the destination, until I saw where we were. It was an old, decrepit house, set far back from the road and half swallowed by the overgrown trees and vines around it. It looked like no one had lived there for years, maybe decades. Every instinct was telling me to get the hell out of there. I put the car in park and turned to tell my passenger we had arrived, but the words died in my throat. The back seat was empty. He was gone. I spun around, scanning the area outside, but there was no sign of him. I hadn't heard the door open or close, and it would have been impossible for him to slip away in the brief moment my eyes were on the road. It was like he had vanished into thin air. With a growing sense of dread, I pulled out my phone to report the incident to the rideshare company. But as I scrolled through my trip history, my blood ran cold. The ride I had just completed wasn't there. No record of the pickup location, no trace of the destination. It was as if it had never happened. I sat there for a long moment, trying to process what had just occurred, telling myself there had to be a rational explanation. A glitch in the app, maybe. But deep down, I knew the truth was something far more sinister, something I couldn't explain. I peeled out of there, tires squealing, not daring to look in the rearview mirror until I was miles away. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that I brushed up against something truly evil that night. Something that lingers in the darkest corners of the world, waiting for the unsuspecting. I wish I could erase the memory as easily as that passenger erased himself from existence. But I'll carry it with me for the rest of my days. A chilling reminder that there are some mysteries in this life that are better left unexplored. As I lay awake at night, replaying those unsettling questions, I can't help but wonder, was he really just a random stranger? Or something far more malevolent? Something that caught a glimpse into the abyss of my own soul? The thought of him still being out there, preying on others, makes my skin crawl. I've started seeing his face in crowds, in the fleeting glimpses of passengers in my back seat. Phantom echoes of his voice over the hum of the engine. I know I should report it, tell someone what happened. But who would believe me? I'm not even sure I believe it myself. It's easier to bury it, pretend it was all just a bad dream. A figment of an overworked, overtired mind. But that house still haunts me. That eerie, abandoned shell of a home beckoning from the edge of a dark wood. Part of me wants to go back in the harsh light of day and prove to myself there's nothing supernatural at work. It was just a disturbed individual and a series of unsettling coincidences. Yet there's another part of me, a deeper, more primal part, that knows I'd be foolish to ever set foot near that cursed place again. That to venture back would be to invite something into my life that I could never escape. A darkness that would follow me, that would slowly chip away at my sanity until one day I too disappear without a trace. So I keep driving, day after day, night after night. The city lights a comforting blur, the mundane chatter of normal passengers a soothing white noise. But always, in the back of my mind, the specter of that fateful ride lurks. The passenger who vanished and the questions he left echoing in his wake. I feel him sometimes in the eerie quiescence between fares. A whisper, a fleeting chill across the back of my neck. I've started dreaming of that house, of being drawn back to it by some inexorable force. Waking in a cold sweat, still feeling the phantom press of the seat belt across my chest. I know I should leave this job, find something else before the dread consumes me altogether. But there's a macabre fascination that keeps me searching the faces of every passenger, bracing for the day his twisted grin slides into my back seat again. It's a sickness, this obsession. It's corroding my reality, bleeding the joy from everything I once held dear. My girlfriend thinks I'm losing it. My friends and family whisper with worried eyes when they think I can't hear. But how could I ever unsee what I've seen? Unfeel that sickly, sinking horror of realization? It's a virus of the soul, and I fear there's no cure but the grave. Or perhaps to give in to that sinister siren's call and let the abyss take me too. Perhaps one day, someone else will tell my story. The rideshare driver who picked up the wrong passenger and was never seen again. Just another urban legend whispered by those who dance too close to the shadows and live to regret it. Until then, I'll haunt these streets, a shell of the man I once was. Forever waiting. Forever wondering when he'll come back to finish what he started. To take me on one last, hellish ride into the mouth of madness itself. Moving into a new place is always a mix of excitement and unease. You never quite know what quirks or surprises might be lurking in the corners. But nothing could have prepared me for the sheer mind-bending horror that my tiny new apartment had in store. At first, it was little things. I'd come home from work and find a book I didn't recognize on my shelf or a mug in the sink I could swear I'd never seen before. I chalked it up to the stress of the move, the long hours at my new job. Figured I was just tired, forgetful, but then the photos started appearing. Snapshots of strangers, tucked between the frames of my own family and friends. Faces that seemed vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place. They gave me a chill every time I looked at them, like they were staring right through me. I tried to rationalize it, tell myself maybe the previous tenant had left them behind. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. There was something deeply wrong with this place, something I couldn't put my finger on. It wasn't until I woke up one morning and found my furniture completely rearranged that the full gravity of the situation hit me. My bed was on the opposite wall, my desk shoved into a corner it had never been in before. And in the center of the room, a chair I had never laid eyes on in my life. I started to shake, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. This wasn't just me being scatterbrained. Someone or something was messing with my space, violating the one place I was supposed to feel safe. I resolved to get out, to break my lease and never look back. I started packing with frantic, trembling hands, throwing my belongings haphazardly into boxes. But every time I looked up, something else had changed. New stains on the carpet, scratches on the walls that hadn't been there moments before. By the time I got to the front door, I was practically hyperventilating. My heart was pounding out of my chest, my vision blurring at the edges. I reached for the knob, desperate to feel the cool outside air on my face. But the door wouldn't budge. I yanked on it until my arm ached, but it was like it was sealed shut. I spun around, ready to try the windows, but what I saw made my blood run cold. The room had shifted again, but not just the furniture this time. The very layout had changed, doors and hallways where there had been none before. It was like the apartment was expanding, morphing before my very eyes. I ran from door to door, each one leading not to the outside, but to another twisted version of my own apartment. The details were different, the color of the walls, the arrangement of the furniture, but the oppressive, sinister atmosphere was the same. I was trapped in a labyrinth of my own home, and with each new room, I could feel unseen eyes boring into the back of my neck, the hairs standing up on my arms. I wasn't alone in this nightmare. That's when I saw it. On the table in one of the doppelganger living rooms, a piece of paper that hadn't been there before. I approached it with shaking steps, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. It was a note, written in a hand I recognized with sickening certainty as my own. "You should never have come here," it read. And below that, in a darker, angrier scroll, "Now you can never leave." I crumpled to the floor, the note clutched in my fist. Tears streamed down my face as the weight of my predicament crashed over me. I was a prisoner in my own personal hell, a fly caught in a web of shifting walls and dark, watchful presences. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time lost all meaning in that place. I wandered the ever-changing rooms in a daze, my mind reeling, trying to grasp onto some shred of sanity. I found myself talking to the shadows, pleading with whatever malevolent force had ensnared me, begging for release, for mercy. But the only answer was the creaking of floorboards, the groaning of settling walls that sounded almost like laughter. Sometimes, in the deafening silence, I would hear whispers. Voices that sounded like mine, but not quite. Taunting me, mocking my despair. "You're one of us now," they would hiss from the darkened corners. "You'll never escape." I tried to shut them out, to cling to the memories of my life before. But even those began to twist and warp until I couldn't be sure what was real and what was just another trick of this hellish place. I would find myself in rooms that resembled my childhood home, but with a sinister, rotten edge. Family photos with faces blurred and distorted, toys that seemed to move and watch me when I looked away. The apartment was feeding on my mind, my memories, turning every scrap of comfort and familiarity against me. I could feel my grip on reality slipping, my sense of self eroding with each new horror. And always, in every room, the shadows lurked, darker than the deepest night, with a palpable, malicious weight. I could feel them circling me, drawing ever closer, waiting for me to finally succumb, to become one with the madness of this place. As I sit here now, huddled in a corner of a room I've never seen before, I can feel the last vestiges of my sanity crumbling. The whispers are getting louder, more insistent. The walls are closing in, the shadows reaching out with hungry tendrils. I don't know how much longer I can hold on, how much longer I can resist the call to surrender, to let myself be swallowed whole by this nightmare. Part of me wonders if that would be easier, if the torment would end if I simply gave in. But then I think of that note, of the warning I didn't heed. "You should never have come here." If only I had listened, if only I had known the price of my foolish desire for a fresh start. Now I am trapped forever in this hellish maze, this twisted reflection of my own life. A prisoner of the house that changes, that feeds on the darkest corners of my own mind. And as the shadows finally engulf me, as the whispers become a deafening roar, I know with grim certainty that I will never be free. There's a stretch of highway out in the middle of nowhere that truckers whisper about. They say if you drive it at just the wrong time, you might never find your way off. I always laughed off those stories, chalked them up to boredom and too much time on the road. But that was before I found myself on that very stretch, watching the miles tick by with a growing sense of unease. It started off like any other long haul. I had a load to deliver cross-country, and I was making good time. The road was quiet, just a few other trucks and the occasional rest stop. I had my music playing, a thermos of coffee in the cup holder, settled in for the long drive ahead. But somewhere around the second hour, I started to feel like something wasn't quite right. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The road looked the same, the signs for the next few towns ticking by like they should. But there was a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach, a sense that I had seen that exact sequence of signs before. I shook it off, told myself I was just tired, stared at the road ahead, the monotonous stretch of asphalt and dashed yellow lines. But the feeling wouldn't go away. If anything, it was getting stronger, a creeping certainty that I was caught in some sort of loop. I checked my GPS, hoping to see the comforting line of my route stretching out ahead. But the screen was glitching, the little arrow that represented my truck jerking and stuttering. The estimated time of arrival kept jumping around, going from 2 hours to 10 and back again. I felt a trickle of sweat run down my back, my hands tightening on the wheel. Something was very wrong here. I flipped to the radio, hoping to catch a weather report or a traffic update. But there was nothing but static, a low, ominous hiss that seemed to fill the cab. I looked at the road signs again, a chill running through me as I realized they were repeating the same names and mile markers over and over. It was like I was driving in circles, but that was impossible. The road was straight, no turns or exits in sight. I pressed down on the accelerator, the engine roaring as I tried to outrun whatever glitch or anomaly I was caught in. But the faster I went, the more the landscape seemed to blur and twist, the lines of the road warping and bending in a way that made my stomach turn. I had to stop to try and get my bearings. I pulled into the next rest area, my hands shaking as I put the truck in park. I stumbled out of the cab, my legs feeling like jelly as I looked around. The rest stop was deserted, just a few empty parking spaces and a lonely vending machine. But as I walked towards the restroom, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. A flash of movement, a figure darting behind the building. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't alone out here. I took a step back towards my truck, my keys clutched tightly in my hand. But then I heard it. A voice calling my name. It was coming from behind the restroom, a hoarse, desperate whisper. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I found myself moving towards it, my feet carrying me as if of their own accord. As I rounded the corner, I saw him. Another trucker, his face pale and haggard, his eyes wide with terror. He was gripping the wall for support, his other hand outstretched towards me. "Help me," he croaked, his voice cracking. "I've been here for so long. I can't find my way out." I stared at him, a cold realization washing over me. He was trapped here, just like I was. Caught in some endless loop of road and rest stop, doomed to drive forever. I opened my mouth to respond, to ask him how long he had been here. But then I saw his truck, parked just behind him. And my blood ran cold. It was my truck. Same make, same model, same license plate. And in the driver's seat, staring back at me with a face twisted in anguish, was myself. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some sort of hallucination, a waking nightmare brought on by too many hours on the road. But then the radio in my truck crackled to life, a voice breaking through the static. It was a news report, the announcer's tone grave and somber. "We have reports of a fatal accident on Highway 101, he said. A truck driver identified as my name appears to have lost control of his vehicle. Emergency services are on the scene, but there are no survivors." I felt my knees give out, my body collapsing against the rough concrete of the rest stop. This couldn't be real. I couldn't be dead. But as I looked at the other version of myself, at the desperation and hopelessness in his eyes, I knew it was true. I was trapped here in this purgatory of endless road and repeated rest stops, doomed to drive forever, to watch myself die over and over again in an infinite loop of my own personal hell. As I dragged myself back to my truck, the weight of my fate pressing down on me like a physical thing, I could only think of one thing. Those old trucker legends, the ones I had always dismissed as superstition and exaggeration, they were true, all of them. And now I was a part of them. Another cautionary tale to be whispered about over late-night coffees and crackly radios. The trucker who drove the highway to nowhere, forever chasing a destination he could never reach. As I put the truck in gear, the road stretching out before me in an endless, mocking ribbon, I could only hope that somewhere, in some other life or reality, I had made it to my destination. That some version of me had escaped this nightmare, had found his way home. But for me, for the version of me trapped on this endless road, there would be no escape. Just the endless miles, the static on the radio, and the knowledge that I would be driving this highway for eternity, a ghost in my own machine. And as I merged back onto the highway, the lines of the road blurring and twisting once again, I could swear I heard them. The whispers of the other truckers, the ones who had come before me, welcoming me to the road that never ends, to the fate I could not escape. We thought we had found the perfect escape. A remote cabin nestled deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. A chance to get away from the hustle and bustle of city life, to reconnect with each other and nature. But what we found in those woods was something far more sinister than the peace and quiet we craved. The first night as we lay in bed, we heard it. A whisper, so faintly thought it might have been the rustling of leaves outside. But then it came again, louder, more distinct. A voice calling our names. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked at Sarah, saw the fear in her eyes. Did you hear that? I whispered, my voice hoarse. She nodded, her hand gripping mine tightly. It sounded like it was coming from outside, she said, her eyes darting to the window. I slid out of bed, the floorboards creaking under my feet. I crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. But there was nothing there, just the still, silent forest. We tried to brush it off, told ourselves it was just the wind playing tricks on us. But the next night it happened again, and the night after that. Each time, the voice seemed to be getting closer, more insistent. By the fourth night, we were both on edge, jumpy and irritable, snapping at each other over little things. The whispers had become a constant presence, a sinister backdrop to our every waking moment. That's when things took an even darker turn. We were sitting at the kitchen table, picking at our dinner, when Sarah suddenly froze. Her fork clattered to the plate, her face draining of color. It knows, she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. It knows about the fight we had before we left. I stared at her, a chill running down my spine. She was right. The voice had been whispering about our argument, repeating the hurtful words we'd hurled at each other in the heat of the moment. But how could it know? We were alone out here, miles from anyone else. Unless we weren't alone at all. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. We need to leave, I said, my voice shaking. We need to get out of here now. But even as I said it, I knew it was too late. The whispers had become a constant hum, a malevolent presence that seemed to permeate every corner of the cabin. We spent that night huddled together in bed, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. The whispers never stopped, a ceaseless litany of our deepest secrets and darkest fears. By morning, we were exhausted, our nerves frayed to the breaking point. We packed our bags with shaking hands, desperate to flee this nightmare. But as we stepped out onto the porch, our hearts sank. There, scattered across the ground, were dozens of photographs. Pictures of us sleeping in bed, arguing at the table, cowering in fear. And in each photo, a shadowy figure lurked in the background, watching us with malevolent intent. We ran then, tearing through the woods with reckless abandon. Branches tore at our faces, roots tripped our feet, but we didn't care. All that mattered was getting away, putting as much distance between us and that accursed cabin as possible. We finally stumbled out onto the main road, gasping for breath. We flagged down a passing car, our faces streaked with tears and dirt. As we poured out our story to the bewildered driver, the words sounded crazy, even to our own ears. But he took pity on us, agreed to give us a ride to the nearest town. We collapsed into the back seat, the reality of our ordeal hitting us like a ton of bricks. What had we just experienced? One malevolent force had targeted us, invaded our most private moments. But even as we asked ourselves these questions, we couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That whatever had haunted us in that cabin wasn't content to let us go so easily. The whispers started again that very night as we lay in a cheap motel bed. Fainter now, but no less sinister. It was as if the voice had followed us, latched onto our very souls. In the weeks and months that followed, we tried to put the pieces of our lives back together. But the experience had changed us, left indelible scars on our psyches. We jumped at every unexpected noise, saw malevolent shadows lurking in every corner. Our relationship, once so strong, began to crumble under the weight of our shared trauma. And always, in the background, the whispers continued. A constant reminder of the horror we had faced, the evil we had brought back with us. Now, years later, I still hear them. In the quiet moments before sleep, in the emptiness of my new apartment. Sarah and I drifted apart, unable to look at each other without seeing the reflection of that terrible cabin. But the whispers never let me forget. They're a part of me now, a sinister soundtrack to my every waking moment. Sometimes, in my darkest hours, I find myself wondering if they were ever real at all. If maybe, in some twisted way, they were a manifestation of my own deepest fears and insecurities. But then I'll catch a glimpse of a shadowy figure out of the corner of my eye, hear a sinister chuckle in a crowded room. And I know, with grim certainty, that the evil we faced in that cabin was all too real. I've tried to warn others, to share my story as a cautionary tale, but most people just look at me with a mixture of pity and disbelief. They can't comprehend the horror I've lived with, the toll it's taken on my soul. But I know there are others out there like me, other victims of the whispering darkness, struggling to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of unimaginable terror. And to them, I say this: you are not alone. The whispers may never fade, the shadows may never truly recede, but you are stronger than the evil that haunts you. You survived, and that is a victory in itself. As for me, I take each day as it comes. I try to find moments of peace and normalcy where I can, to hold on to the hope that someday the whispers will finally fall silent. But deep down, I know the truth. The voice in the cabin, the malevolent presence that latched onto my soul, it's waiting, biding its time until it can claim its next victim. And when that day comes, when some other unsuspecting soul stumbles across that accursed cabin in the woods, I pray they have the strength to fight, to cling to their sanity in the face of unrelenting horror. Because once the whispers start, once the shadows begin to gather, there is no escape. Only survival in the face of an evil that knows no bounds. There's an old saying that goes, "Be careful what you wish for." I used to think it was just a silly cliche, a warning against greed or unrealistic expectations. But now, after what happened in my own home, I understand the darker truth behind those words. Sometimes, the things we wish for can turn out to be our worst nightmares. It started on a night like any other. I was coming home from a long walk, my mind still buzzing with the day's stresses and anxieties. As I approached my front porch, I went through the familiar motions, up the 3 small steps, across the worn welcome mat, key in the lock. But as I swung the door open, something made me pause. I turned back to look at the steps, a frown creasing my brow. Something wasn't right. I counted them again, just to be sure. 1, 2, 3, 4. There were 4 steps leading up to my porch. But that was impossible. I had lived in this house for years, and I knew with absolute certainty that there had always been only 3. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the discrepancy. I must be more tired than I thought, my mind playing tricks on me in the dim evening light. I stepped inside, locking the door firmly behind me. But as I went about my nightly routine, the unease continued to grow. Small things seemed off, not quite how I remembered them. The pictures on the mantel were in a different order, the books on my shelf rearranged. At first, I tried to write it off as forgetfulness, the natural result of a busy and stressful life. As I lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. It was as if the very fabric of my reality had been tweaked, subtly but undeniably. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. The next morning, I woke with a start, the events of the previous night coming back to me in a rush. I stumbled to the window, my heart pounding in my chest as I looked out at the front porch. There, in the harsh light of day, I counted again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 steps. Somehow overnight, another one had appeared. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead, my hands trembling as I gripped the windowsill. This couldn't be happening. It defied all logic, all reason. But the evidence was right there in front of me, solid and undeniable. I forced myself to go about my day as normal, trying to ignore the growing sense of wrongness that pervaded every corner of my house. But everywhere I looked, I found more changes. The living room furniture had been rearranged, the pictures on the walls replaced with unfamiliar faces. It was as if someone or something was slowly erasing every trace of the life I had built. As the days passed, the changes became more profound, more disturbing. The layout of the rooms shifted, doors appearing where there had been none before, windows looking out onto strange and unfamiliar landscapes. And always, with each passing day, another step appeared on the front porch. I became a prisoner in my own home, afraid to leave lest the outside world prove as mutable and unstable as my surroundings. I stopped answering the phone, stopped opening the door to concerned friends and neighbors. I couldn't bear the thought of trying to explain what was happening to me, of seeing the disbelief and pity in their eyes. But even in my self-imposed isolation, I couldn't escape the changes. They began to happen in front of my very eyes, the walls shifting and warping like some sort of surreal funhouse. I would blink, and the room around me would be different, the furniture rearranged, the color of the walls changed. And then there were the reflections. It started with small things, a lag between my movements and those of my mirror image, a slight desynchronization that I tried to dismiss as a trick of the light. But as the days turned into weeks, the differences became more pronounced, more disturbing. My reflection would smile when I didn't, would move objects that remained stationary in the real world. It was as if it had taken on a life of its own, a sinister doppelganger that mocked me from the other side of the glass. I began to dread the sight of my own face, the fear of what I might see in those familiar yet alien features. I started avoiding mirrors altogether, covering them with sheets and turning them to face the wall. But still, I could feel its presence, watching me from every reflective surface, biding its time. The final straw came on a night when the house had grown so labyrinthine, so twisted and wrong, that I could scarcely navigate its halls. I stumbled through doorways that led to impossible places, stairs that climbed to nowhere. And all the while, the presence in the mirrors grew stronger, more insistent. I found myself at the foot of the staircase, staring up at a dizzying spiral of steps that stretched up and up, far beyond where the second floor should have been. And there, at the top, I saw a figure that was me, and yet not me, a twisted, malevolent version of myself, grinning down at me with a smile that held no warmth. I turned to run, my heart hammering in my throat. But everywhere I turned, I saw only more stairs, more doorways leading to impossible places. And always, in every mirror and reflective surface, the figure followed, drawing ever closer. In desperation, I fled to the one place I had always avoided, the one room that had remained unchanged amidst the shifting chaos of the house. The bathroom, with its large, ornate mirror that covered an entire wall. I stumbled inside, slamming the door behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. And there, in the harsh fluorescent light, I finally came face to face with my tormentor. It was me, but not me. A version of myself with eyes that glittered with malice, with a smile that stretched too wide, too far. It reached out, its hand pressing against the glass, and I felt a jolt of terror as I realized that the barrier between us was growing thin, stretched to the breaking point. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in a battle of wills with my own twisted reflection. But in the end, I knew I had only one choice. I had to face the horror that had invaded my home, my life. I had to confront the darkness that wore my face. With a scream of defiance, I lunged forward, my hands gripping the edges of the mirror. I pulled with all my strength, feeling the glass shudder and crack beneath my fingers. And then, with a final, sickening lurch, the mirror shattered, exploding outwards in a rain of jagged shards. I felt the world tilt and spin around me, felt the boundaries of reality crumble and fall away. And then, with a sudden, wrenching sensation, I found myself standing on the front porch, blinking in the harsh light of day. I looked down, counting the steps beneath my feet. 1, 2, 3. 3 steps, just as there had always been. Just as there should be. But even as relief washed over me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something fundamental and irreversible. I turned back to the house, half expecting to see the twisted, impossible architecture of my nightmares. But it was just my home, familiar and ordinary in the daylight. I stepped inside, my heart still pounding in my chest. Everything was as it should be, every object in its rightful place. But as I looked around, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something malevolent and patient, waiting for its chance to strike again. And so I live my life in a state of constant unease, never quite sure what is real and what is a product of my own fractured psyche. I go through the motions of normalcy, but always with the knowledge that the darkness is still out there, waiting for me to let my guard down. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear it. the creaking of floorboards, the groaning of settling walls. And sometimes, when I catch my reflection in the corner of my eye, I swear I see it smile. A smile that is me, and yet not me. A smile that holds the promise of horrors yet to come. Moving into a new apartment is always a gamble. You never know what kind of neighbors you'll end up with. Will they be friendly? Nosy? Loud? When I signed the lease on my cozy little studio, I was just happy to have found an affordable place in a decent part of town. I didn't give much thought to the other tenants. But now, after what I've experienced, I realize that was a mistake. A big mistake. It started about a week after I moved in. I was settling into my new routine, getting used to the creaks and groans of the old building. One night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a sound that made my eyes snap open. It was coming from the apartment next door, the one that had been empty since I arrived. At first, I thought it might be the landlord showing the unit to a prospective tenant. But as I listened more closely, I realized the sounds were too rhythmic, too deliberate for that. It sounded like someone was moving furniture, rearranging the space. But who would be doing that in the middle of the night? I lay there in the darkness, my heart pounding as I strained to hear more. There were footsteps, slow and heavy, pacing back and forth. And then, just as suddenly as they had begun, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was somehow even more unnerving. Over the next few days, I tried to put the incident out of my mind. I asked a few of the other tenants if they had heard anything unusual, but they all looked at me like I was crazy. That apartment's been empty for months, they said, shaking their heads. No one's moved in, but the sounds continued night after night. Sometimes it was the scraping of furniture, other times the muffled sound of laughter or conversation, as if there was a party going on that I hadn't been invited to. I started to dread the hours of darkness, lying awake with my eyes glued to the wall that separated my bedroom from the empty apartment. One evening, driven by a mixture of curiosity and sleep-deprived desperation, I decided to investigate. I waited until the sound started up again, then crept out into the hallway. The door to the empty apartment loomed before me, the brass numbers tarnished and dull. I pressed my ear to the wood, holding my breath as I listened. Yes, there it was, the unmistakable sound of movement, of life. Emboldened, I reached for the knob, half expecting it to be locked. But to my surprise, it turned easily in my hand. I pushed the door open, my heart in my throat as I peered into the darkness beyond. At first, I couldn't make out anything. The room was pitch black, the air heavy and still. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the center of the empty living room, stood a large, ornate mirror. It was old, the frame tarnished and spotted with age. But what caught my attention was the reflection staring back at me. It was my apartment, down to the last detail, the same furniture, the same clutter. But there was one key difference. In the reflection, there was a figure seated on my couch. A figure that looked eerily like me, but with a smile that was just a little too wide, a little too knowing. As I watched in horror, the figure slowly turned its head, its eyes locking with mine through the glass. I stumbled backwards, a scream lodging in my throat. I slammed the door shut, my hands shaking so badly I could hardly turn the lock. I raced back to my apartment, locking myself inside and collapsing onto the bed. I didn't sleep that night or the next. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that smile, those eyes boring into me. I knew I should tell someone, report the strange goings-on to the landlord or the police. But who would believe me? Even I was starting to doubt my own sanity. As the days turned into weeks, the sounds from the empty apartment grew louder, more frequent. I became a prisoner in my own home, jumping at every creak and groan. I stopped inviting friends over, stopped going out except when absolutely necessary. I knew people were starting to whisper about me, the crazy girl in apartment 3B. But I didn't care. All that mattered was surviving the night, making it through to the next day. And then, one evening, everything changed. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to ignore the sounds of laughter and music coming from next door. Suddenly, there was a knock at my door. A soft, almost tentative tapping that made my heart leap into my throat. I froze, hardly daring to breathe. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. I crept to the door, my hand hovering over the knob. I knew I shouldn't open it, knew that nothing good could come from confronting whatever was on the other side. But some morbid curiosity, some desperate need for answers, compelled me forward. I swung the door open, bracing myself for the worst. But there was no one there. The hallway was empty, stretching out in both directions. I stepped out, my bare feet sinking into the worn carpet. And then I heard it, a sound that made my heart stop dead in my chest. It was coming from inside my apartment. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, of someone moving around in my space. I whirled around, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream. There, standing in the middle of my living room, was the figure from the mirror. My doppelganger, grinning at me with that eerily familiar smile. I don't remember much of what happened next. I know I ran, tearing down the hallway and out into the night. I know I ended up at a police station, babbling incoherently about mirrors and reflections and apartments that weren't empty. I know they looked at me with a mixture of pity and concern, making soothing noises as they guided me to a chair. In the end, they chalked it up to stress, to an overactive imagination. They sent me home with a sedative and a number for a therapist. But I knew the truth. I knew that whatever had been haunting the empty apartment had finally found its way into my world. And I knew that I would never be free of it, never be able to unsee the horror that lurked behind that tarnished mirror. I moved out the next day, leaving most of my belongings behind. I couldn't bear the thought of going back, of facing the thing that wore my face. I drifted from place to place, never staying in one city for too long. But no matter where I go, no matter how far I run, I can still feel it watching me, waiting for me. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I'll catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow that's just a little too familiar, a reflection that doesn't quite match my own. And I know that it's only a matter of time before it finds me again, before it drags me back into that nightmare world of twisted mirrors and silent, waiting apartments. So I keep moving, keep looking over my shoulder. And I pray that someday, somehow, I'll find a way to break free of the horror that has consumed my life. But deep down, I know the truth. Once you've seen what lurks behind the mirror, there's no going back. There's only the long, slow descent into madness, into a world where the line between reality and reflection blurs until there's nothing left but the smiling, waiting darkness. There's a park near my house where I love to go running. It's a peaceful place, with winding trails that snake through tall trees and past still ponds. I've always found solace there, a quiet escape from the chaos of daily life. But now, after what happened last night, I don't know if I'll ever be able to set foot on those trails again. It was just after sunset, that eerie twilight hour when the world seems to balance on the edge of light and darkness. I was on my usual route, my feet pounding out a steady rhythm against the packed dirt. I had my headphones in, lost in the music and the motion, when a flicker of movement caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just another jogger, someone else out for an evening run. But as the figure drew closer, I realized there was something off about it. Something in the way it moved, too smooth and fluid to be entirely human. I slowed my pace, squinting through the gathering darkness to get a better look. The figure was tall and slender, dressed in nondescript black clothing. But it was the face that made my blood run cold. Or rather, the lack of one. Where the person's features should have been, there was only a blur, a smudge of shadows that seemed to shift and change with each step. It was like trying to make out an image through frosted glass, all vague shapes and muted colors. I felt a prickle of unease run down my spine, a primal instinct telling me to run, to get as far away from this thing as possible. But some morbid fascination kept me rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on the approaching figure. As it drew level with me, I saw that it wasn't just the face that was wrong. The entire body seemed to blur at the edges, as if it were not quite solid, not quite real. And then, to my horror, it began to match my pace, falling into step beside me like some sort of twisted running partner. I tried to speed up, to put some distance between myself and the faceless thing. But no matter how fast I ran, it kept pace effortlessly, its long legs eating up the ground with an eerie, loping grace. I could feel panic starting to claw at my throat, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps that had nothing to do with exertion. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call for help, but my fingers were shaking so badly I could barely unlock the screen. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure veered off the path and into the trees. I watched it go, my heart hammering in my chest, half expecting it to come bounding back out of the darkness at any moment. But it didn't. The woods were silent, the only sound the rasp of my own labored breathing. I stood there for a long moment, my legs trembling beneath me, before I turned and ran, tearing blindly down the path and out of the park. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my own front porch, my keys jangling in my shaking hands as I struggled to unlock the door. I stumbled inside, slamming and locking it behind me, as if flimsy wood and metal could keep the horrors of the night at bay. I spent the rest of the evening huddled on my couch, jumping at every creak and groan of the settling house. I tried to tell myself that it had just been a trick of the light, a product of an overactive imagination and too many late-night horror movies. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. I knew that something had followed me in that park, something that defied explanation or reason. It wasn't until the next morning, as I was getting ready for work, that I realized the true extent of the nightmare. I was in the bathroom, brushing my teeth, when I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirror. But where my face should have been, there was only a blur, a smear of shadows that shifted and danced before my eyes. I recoiled in horror, my toothbrush clattering into the sink. I blinked hard, rubbing at my eyes as if I could wipe away the terrifying image. But when I looked again, it was still there, my face, or what was left of it, staring back at me from the glass. I don't remember much of what happened after that. I know I called in sick to work, stammering out some excuse about a stomach bug. I know I spent hours pacing my apartment, avoiding mirrors and reflective surfaces like the plague. And I know that, as the sun began to set once again, I found myself drawn back to the park, back to the place where it had all begun. I don't know what I was hoping to find. Answers, perhaps. Or maybe just proof that I wasn't going insane, that the horror I had witnessed was real. But as I stepped onto the trail, my heart in my throat and my hands clenched into fists at my sides, I saw it again. The figure, the faceless thing, waiting for me in the deepening shadows. This time, I didn't run. I couldn't. It was like my feet were rooted to the ground, like some invisible force was holding me in place. And as the figure began to walk towards me, its movement smooth and sinuous and utterly wrong, I felt a scream bubbling up in my throat, a sound of pure, primal terror. But before I could give voice to it, before I could even draw a breath, the figure was upon me. It reached out with one long, blurred arm, and I felt a cold, clammy hand close around my wrist. And then, with a sickening lurch, I felt myself being pulled forward, drawn into the darkness that swirled and eddied around the faceless thing. I don't know how long I walked with it, through the twisting trails and deep, silent woods. Time seemed to lose all meaning, the minutes and hours bleeding together into one endless, nightmarish march. And all the while, the figure remained at my side, its hand gripping mine with a strength that belied its ethereal form. I tried to speak, to cry out for help, but my voice seemed to die in my throat, swallowed up by the oppressive silence that pressed in on me from all sides. And when I looked down at my hands, I saw to my horror that they were beginning to blur and smear, just like the figures in human visage. It was only when we reached the edge of the park, when the lights of the city began to glimmer through the trees, that the figure finally released me. It stepped back, melting into the shadows as if it had never been. And I was left standing there, shaking and alone, the echoes of our footsteps still ringing in my ears. I don't know what happened to me that night, or what the faceless thing wanted from me. I don't know if it was a ghost, a demon, or something else entirely, something beyond human comprehension. All I know is that it changed me, in ways I'm still struggling to understand. I can't look in mirrors anymore. Can't bear to see the blurred, distorted thing that stares back at me from the glass. And sometimes, when I'm out in crowded places, I'll catch a glimpse of a familiar silhouette, a long, lean figure that moves with a grace that is utterly inhuman. I try to tell myself that it's just my mind playing tricks on me, that the trauma of that night has left me seeing shadows where there are none. But deep down, I know the truth. I know that the faceless thing is still out there, waiting for me. And I know that one day it will come for me again, and there will be no escape, no return to the life I once knew. So now I keep to myself. I avoid the park, avoid the woods, and the darkness that lurks within them. And I pray every night that the thing that walks without a face will never find me again. But even as I whisper those desperate pleas into the silence of my bedroom, I can feel it watching me, waiting for the moment when I let my guard down. And I know that when that moment comes, I will be lost forever, drawn into the shadows and the silence, never to return. There's a stretch of highway, about an hour outside the city, that I've driven more times than I can count. It's a lonely road, especially at night, with nothing but farmland and the occasional gas station to break up the monotony. I've always found a strange sort of peace in the emptiness, the hypnotic hum of the engine and the black ribbon of asphalt stretching out before me. But last night, on that familiar stretch of road, I experienced a terror that I know will haunt me for the rest of my days. It started with a text message. I was about halfway through my usual route, my eyes flicking between the road and the GPS display when my phone buzzed in the cup holder. I glanced down, expecting to see a notification from my music app or maybe a missed call from my girlfriend. But what I saw instead made my blood run cold. The message was from an unknown number, and it contained just 2 words, "Help me." But that wasn't the part that made my heart skip a beat. It was the name attached to the message, the name that I had seen countless times before, printed on forms and ID badges. My own name. I stared at the screen, my mind reeling. Was this some kind of prank? A glitch in the system? With shaking fingers, I tapped out a reply. "Who is this?" The response came seconds later, and it sent a chill down my spine. "It's you. Please help me." I nearly swerved off the road, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some kind of mistake, a crossed wire or a hacker playing a sick joke. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I could feel a creeping sense of dread settling over me, a certainty that something was very, very wrong. The next message came a few minutes later, and it was even more unsettling than the first. "They're watching you. They know where you are." I glanced around wildly, my eyes searching the dark fields and empty road for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the steady thrum of the engine and the faint glow of the dashboard lights. I tried to ignore the messages, to write them off as a bizarre anomaly. But they kept coming, each one more urgent and frightening than the last. "You're in danger. They're coming for you. You need to get off the road now. Please, you have to help me. You're the only one who can." By the time I reached the next gas station, my nerves were shot. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn off the ignition, and my heart was pounding in my ears like a drum. I stumbled into the bright fluorescent light of the convenience store, my eyes darting around for any sign of the mysterious that my doppelganger had warned me about. The clerk behind the counter gave me a strange look as I approached, my face pale and my eyes wide with fear. I opened my mouth to ask for help, to beg him to call the police or at least let me use his phone. But before I could get the words out, he held up a hand, a small, knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You forgot your phone," he said, his voice strangely flat and emotionless. He held out a device, a perfect replica of my own phone, complete with the same case and the same crack in the screen from where I had dropped it months ago. I stared at him, my mouth going dry. "How did you?" I managed to croak out, but he just shook his head, that eerie smile never wavering. "You left it here, hours ago," he said, pressing the phone into my numb fingers. "Don't you remember?" I looked down at the screen, and my heart nearly stopped. There, in the message history, was a string of texts, each one more frantic and desperate than the last. And they were all from me, pleading for help, warning of some impending danger that I couldn't quite understand. I stumbled back to my car, my mind reeling. I didn't remember sending those messages, didn't remember stopping at this gas station before. But the evidence was right there in my hand, as clear and undeniable as the road stretching out before me. I tried to call my girlfriend, my fingers fumbling over the keys. But the call wouldn't go through, the phone just giving me a static-filled busy signal. Panicking, I did the only thing I could think of. I started texting myself back, desperately asking what was happening, pleading for an explanation. But the responses were just as confounding and terrifying as before. There's no time. They're almost here. You need to remember. Remember what happened. Please, you have to save yourself. Before it's too late. I could feel hysteria bubbling up in my throat, a scream of pure, primal terror that threatened to tear itself from my lungs. I jammed the key into the ignition, the engine roaring to life as I peeled out of the parking lot, my tires squealing against the pavement. I tore down the road, the speedometer creeping higher and higher as I tried to outrun the mounting sense of dread that clung to me like a second skin. My phone kept buzzing in my pocket, each new message adding to the rising tide of panic that threatened to drown me. And then, through the static-filled radio, I heard it. A news report, the words cutting through the white noise like a knife. Breaking news, a major accident on Highway 10 near mile marker 73. A single vehicle appears to have veered off the road and crashed into a ditch. Emergency responders are en route, but preliminary reports suggest there are no survivors. I felt the world tilt on its axis, my breath catching in my throat. Mile marker 73. That was where I was, where I had been heading all along. And the description of the accident, the solitary car veering off the road, it was all too familiar, all too close to the bone. With a shaking hand, I looked down at my phone, at the string of increasingly desperate messages that filled the screen. And then, with a sickening lurch of realization, I understood. The messages weren't from a stranger or from some glitch in the system. They were from me, from some other version of myself that had already lived through this nightmare, that had already met the fate that now loomed before me like a gaping maw. I let out a choked sob, my hands clenching around the phone as if it were a lifeline. But I knew, with a grim certainty that settled in the pit of my stomach, that there was no escape, no way to outrun the inevitable. The messages had been a warning, a desperate plea from a doomed version of myself to the one that still had a chance. But it was too late. The radio crackled with static, the emergency responders' voices fading in and out like ghosts on the airways. And my phone, once my only connection to the world beyond my car, went dead in my hands, the screen fading to black as if it had never been. In the end, I suppose I should have known better. Should have heeded the warnings, should have listened to the desperate pleas of my other self. But in that moment, with the road stretching out before me and the night pressing in on all sides, all I could do was keep driving, keep pushing forward into the darkness, even as I knew, with a sinking certainty, that I was heading towards my own doom. And now, as I sit here in the wreckage of my car, my body broken and my mind shattered, I can only hope that somewhere, in some other timeline or dimension, another version of me will get the message, will heed the warning that I so foolishly ignored. But even as I cling to that desperate hope, I know the truth. The call for help, the desperate plea from beyond the veil, it was always too late. And in the end, there is no escape, no way to outrun the fate that awaits us all, in the dark and lonely places that lie beyond the reach of the living. #no way out. The engine roars as I floor the accelerator, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. But no matter how fast I go, the road just stretches on forever. Same trees, same curves. There's no end in sight. It all started when I decided to take a shortcut. I was heading home late at night after a long day at work. I'd made this drive 1,000 times before, but I was exhausted and just wanted to get back as quickly as possible. So when my GPS showed a route that would shave 30 minutes off my trip, I figured why not. I turned off the highway onto a narrow side road cutting through dense forest. There were no streetlights, just my headlights piercing the darkness ahead. The road twisted and turned, an endless black snake devouring the white lines. A few miles in, I noticed a set of headlights in my rearview mirror. The car was far behind me, but gaining fast. Soon it was right on my tail, high beams glaring. I sped up a little, expecting it to pass. But it just matched my speed, staying right behind. I accelerated more, taking the curves faster than I should have. The car stuck to me like glue. My heart started racing. I tried to get a glimpse of the driver, but could only make out a dark silhouette. Suddenly I slammed the brakes. The car did the same. I swerved into the opposite lane. It followed. No matter what I did, I couldn't shake it. Panic rising in my throat, I floored it again. My tires screeched as I took a sharp turn and found myself right back where I started. Same trees, same curve. Had I just gone in a circle? No, that was impossible. I kept driving, watching the odometer tick away the miles. 10, 20, 30. But the scenery never changed. With growing dread, I realized I'd passed that same bent oak tree at least 3 times now. The car was still behind me, an ever-present threat. I was trapped in a nightmare loop with no end and no escape. My mind raced through possibilities. Was this some sick game? Was I being punished for something? I tried calling 911, but the call wouldn't go through. Tried the GPS again, but it just kept recalculating, like it couldn't make sense of where I was. An hour passed, maybe more. I was running low on gas. The car kept pace effortlessly, never wavering. In desperation, I pulled over. The car did the same. I grabbed the baseball bat I keep under my seat and stepped out, ready to confront my tormentor. "What do you want?" I screamed into the night. But as I approached the car, I felt my blood turn to ice. It was my car. Same make, same model, same license plate. And in the driver's seat was me, down to the clothes I was wearing, staring ahead blankly. I rubbed my eyes, sure I was hallucinating. But when I looked again, the car was empty. I spun around wildly. It couldn't be. It didn't make any sense. I got back in my car, hands shaking uncontrollably, turned the key and pulled back onto the road. What else could I do? And so I drive. The road goes on and on. No turns, no exit ramps, no end. Just an eternity of asphalt and yellow lines and the weight of the darkness pressing in. The car is behind me, always behind me, matching me mile for mile. A silent, relentless doppelganger. I don't know how much longer I can keep going. Don't know if I'll ever escape this endless loop. All I know is I took a wrong turn somewhere. Now I'm caught in an infinite night. And there's something in the car behind me. #no escape. I should have known the deal was too good to be true. A sprawling apartment in a gorgeous heritage building, right in the heart of downtown. All at a rent I could actually afford on my barista salary. When I asked the landlord why it was so cheap, he mumbled something about renovations on the floor above and wanting a tenant ASAP before the ruckus began. I was so thrilled, I signed the lease on the spot. The first week was blissful. I reveled in my spacious new digs, marveling at the antique crown moldings and hardwood floors that seemed to whisper stories of eras past. It felt like home. Then came the footsteps. It was the middle of the night when I first heard them. A slow, deliberate tread, creaking across the floorboards directly over my bedroom. At first I thought the renovations must have started. But when I checked my phone, it was 3:17 a.m. What workers would be on the job at that ungodly hour? I lay very still, trying to track the footsteps as they meandered unhurriedly above, pacing from one end to the other. It seemed to go on for hours before I finally drifted off. The next day, groggy and irritable, I marched upstairs to investigate. But the under-renovation sign was still plastered on the door and the floor was silent as a tomb. I tried to shrug it off as pipe settling or my mind playing tricks. But it happened again the next night, and the next, each time more insistent, practically stomping a trail above my bed. Each morning revealing no hint of construction or other tenants. Bleary-eyed, I pleaded my case to the landlord. He seemed oddly unsurprised, assuring me that no one could possibly be up there and hinting that I might be happier elsewhere. I was welcome to break my lease, he said, as if he was doing me a kindness. But I just moved in. I had nowhere else to go, so I invested in earplugs and sleeping pills and willed myself to ignore the nightly disturbances. I bought a white noise machine to drown out the sounds, but some nights they would pierce through even that. Then came the gifts. I stumbled into the kitchen one morning to find a teacup on the counter that wasn't mine. Delicate porcelain with a chip on the rim. I racked my brain but couldn't recall any visitor leaving it behind. Next was a silver locket on my nightstand, tarnished and old-fashioned. It held no photos, only a snip of hair tied with ribbon. More items began appearing. A tattered storybook on my shelf, spine cracked from use. A rag doll, faceless and faded, propped on my armchair. None of them were mine, but they felt eerily familiar, like forgotten keepsakes of my own childhood. I changed the locks, bolted the windows, combed the apartment for any hidden entry points. But still they came. The final straw was the message. I found it etched into the layer of dust on my bathroom mirror, invisible until the steam of my shower revealed it. Welcome home. That's when I tried to leave. I waited for daylight, hastily stuffed some clothes into a bag, and strode to the front door with purpose. But the doorknob wouldn't turn. It wasn't locked, the mechanism gave way, but the door remained firmly shut, like it was sealed with cement. I tried the back door. Same. Windows were glued in their frames. Even the fire escape had rusted over, immovable. I was trapped. Panic mounting, I spun towards the phone, but the line was dead. No dial tone, not even static. My cell phone had no signal. Then, above my ragged breathing, I heard them. The footsteps. Directly overhead, same measured pace, but louder now, forceful, annoyed. They stopped, and I could feel a pressure, a presence pushing down. Floorboards creaked. Not above. Behind me. I whirled to face the sound as it moved towards the hallway, towards the stairs. A shadow elongated across the floor, and I realized with pure dread that it was descending, one thump at a time. I scrabbled desperately at the door, pulling with all my strength until my nails cracked. But it held fast. The thumping drew closer, more insistent. My mind whirled. The fire poker. I could defend myself. But as I turned to dash for it, I froze. There in the living room, in what had been an empty armchair a moment ago, sat a figure, indistinct and hazy as a faded photograph. It lifted its head and I saw its face, my face, but gaunt, skin pulled tight over jutting bones. Its eyes bored into me as a lipless mouth stretched into a mockery of a smile. Welcome home, it rasped. I screamed until my throat was raw. I charged the door, slamming my body into it until bruises bloomed. But nothing budged. The thing watched me impassively, that hideous smile never wavering. I fled to the bedroom, locking the door and shoving the dresser against it. As if mere furniture could stop what was now thudding down the hall, rattling the doorknob like a child demanding entry to a locked candy store. The lock clicked. The door creaked open. I closed my eyes and prayed. I'm still praying. There's nowhere to run. It's here, in my sanctuary, wearing my stolen skin. The silent tenant has a voice now, and all it whispers is, welcome home. Hashtag off the beaten path. Trust me, I know these trails like the back of my hand, the guide assured us with a crooked grin. Stick with me and I'll show you sights most tourists never lay eyes on. That's what sold us in the end. The promise of an adventure off the beaten path, far from the chattering crowds and selfie sticks. Just me, my girlfriend Jess, and this wiry old-timer who looked like he'd been carved from the same weathered stone as the canyon. We met him at dawn in the deserted parking lot. He introduced himself as Cal, though he didn't offer a last name. His beaten-up pickup truck was laden with coils of climbing rope, dented camping gear, and a cooler that he said held our lunch. The first few hours were just as advertised. Cal led us along twisting, nameless trails that wound through towering red rock formations, pointing out hidden caves and ancient petroglyphs. Jess and I grinned at each other, thrilled with our find. But as the sun climbed higher, the path seemed to grow more faint, the terrain more challenging. We found ourselves squeezing through increasingly narrow passages, scrambling over boulder fields where no trail was evident. Cal moved nimbly ahead, but we struggled to keep up. Hey, are you sure this is the right way? Jess called out as we paused, sweaty and winded, on a precarious ledge. Shouldn't we maybe head back? Cal looked back over his shoulder, and for a moment, there was something in his eyes I couldn't read. Irritation or maybe amusement. But it was gone as quick as it came. Nonsense, he chuckled. You ain't seen nothing yet. The real treasure's just ahead. I'll fetch us some water from the truck, catch my breath a spell. You two sit tight now. And with that, he vanished around a bend in the canyon wall. We sank gratefully onto a flat rock, swigging the last tepid sips from our bottles. We waited. 5 minutes. 10. 15. No sign of Cal. The air seemed to press heavier, the high walls penning us in on all sides. Even the birdsong had faded, leaving only a dead, hollow silence. We should go check on him, Jess murmured, but she made no move to rise. A flutter of unease stirred in my gut. "Hey, Cal," I shouted, my voice swallowed by the stone. "You okay?" No answer. I forced myself up, legs cramping in protest, and limped in the direction he'd gone. But when I rounded the bend, there was no one there. No truck, no gear, just an endless expanse of bare, sun-baked rock. "Cal?" My voice sounded thin, brittle as the wind-scoured juniper roots. Nothing. Pulse quickening, I stumbled back to Jess. "He's gone. Everything's gone." Her eyes went wide. "What? That's impossible. Where could he?" Her words died as she looked past me. I turned to follow her gaze and felt my blood run cold. The canyon had changed. Where there had been a sheer drop, there was now a slope of loose scree, funneling down into a chasm that yawned like an open throat. The boulder we perched on seemed to teeter on the edge. What the hell? I swallowed hard. "We have to move." Now. Hand in hand, we half ran, half slid down the shifting gravel, kicking up clouds of choking red dust. Thorny brush clawed at our legs. Still no sign of Cal. We finally hit level ground at the canyon floor, lungs heaving. The walls soared up on either side, seeming to lean in, blotting out the sky. I couldn't shake the feeling they were closing in on us, herding us deeper into the belly of the beast. "Look." Jess's voice shook as she pointed down. There in the sand, stark and unmistakable, was a single set of footprints. Work boots, heavily treaded, leading straight ahead into the shadow of the gorge. Cal's boots. We followed, no other choice. But with each bend, each twist, the tracks grew fainter, swallowed by wind and sand and time. Until suddenly, they simply stopped. No scuff, no sign of doubling back. Just gone. Like he'd been plucked straight up into the unforgiving sky. "We have to go back." Jess's fingers dug into my arm. "Retrace our steps." Before, she didn't finish. She didn't need to. We turned, ready to flee. But where the path had been, there was now a sheer stone wall. Unbroken, unsurmountable, as if it had always been. Our own footprints had vanished too, smoothed over like a sigh. The canyon was a perfect, featureless corridor, no end in sight. No exit, no entrance. Just red rock and merciless sun and a silence so heavy it felt like a living thing. We walked. What else could we do? Picked a direction at random and stumbled down it, throats parched, minds numb. The light never seemed to change, forever caught in a purgatory of high noon. It might have been hours. It might have been days. Time stretched and warped until it lost all meaning. Until all that existed was the crunch of our feet on sand, the rasp of our breath, the drumbeat of our pulse in our ears. We found the camp at dusk. Or what passed for dusk in this endless day. It appeared out of nowhere, shimmering like a mirage on the canyon floor. A circle of weathered stones around the ashy bones of a fire. A scattering of dented tin cups. A moth-eaten blanket spread out like a shroud. And on the blanket, glinting dully in the dying light, a knife. Heavy, crude, the blade pitted with rust or something darker. Beside it, a stained leather journal, pages rippling in the hot breeze. Jess reached for it, hand trembling. Cracked it open to a random page, dense with spidery script. Her gasp cut the dead air like a blade. There on the page, rendered in faded ink, were our faces. Jess and I, eyes wild, clothes torn and dusty. Mouth open in a silent scream. And behind us, a figure, tall and lean, more shadow than man. A dark hat pulled low over its face. A single word was scrawled beneath the sketch, underlined twice in a shaking hand. "Run." But there's nowhere to run. The canyon goes on forever. It's taken us, made us its own. Sometimes, in the endless crimson twilight, we see him, the shadow with the dark hat, striding the ridges, flickering in the corners of our eyes. Our guide, our collector. He has many faces, many names, and the canyon has many paths. They all lead here in the end, to the labyrinth of lost souls, to him. Hashtag mirror image. I thought I'd finally made it. Landed that promotion, bought a house in the burbs. The American dream, white picket fence and all. Sure, the place needed a little work. A lick of paint, some new carpet. But it was mine. 2,000 square feet all to myself, after years crammed in a shoebox apartment. The house next door was empty. Had been for a while, according to the realtor. Foreclosure, or maybe the owners just up and left. It happens, she said with a shrug. I didn't think much of it. I was too busy unpacking, making the place my own, hanging my posters, finding the perfect spot for Dad's old recliner. It was a good day. Then night fell. That's when I saw it. A light in the upstairs window of the empty house. Just a flicker like a candle or a flashlight. But definitely a light. I frowned. Probably just a realtor or a maintenance worker. No big deal. I went to bed. But it happened again the next night. And the next. Always around the same time. Always just for a few minutes. I tried to catch a glimpse of who was in there, but the light was too dim, the figure too quick. By the fourth night, my curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight of my own and crept across the lawn, feeling a bit foolish. I was probably just spooking myself over some electrician working late. The front door was unlocked. That was the first odd thing. It swung open soundlessly under my touch into a pitch-black foyer. My flashlight beam seemed swallowed by the darkness. I stepped inside. The place was silent, still. No hum of electricity, nowhere of air conditioning. The air smelled stale, unlived in. I swept my light around the living room, and my heart nearly stopped. There, in the exact same spot as in my house, was my dad's recliner. The same ratty plaid, the same duct tape patching the arm. It couldn't be. I just unpacked it this morning, but there it sat like a ghost of itself. With a shaking hand, I moved the beam to the far wall. My posters. The same ones, in the same order I'd hung them. I stumbled back, mind reeling. This wasn't possible. It had to be some kind of sick joke. But who would go to such lengths? I fled then, slamming the door behind me. Raced back to my own house, my safe haven. Double-checked the lock, like that would keep the strangeness at bay. I didn't sleep that night. Lay staring at the ceiling, jumping at every creak and groan of the settling house. Telling myself there had to be a rational explanation. I almost believed it, too, until I went into the kitchen for my morning coffee and found all my mugs rearranged. Handles pointing left instead of right, the way I'd never keep them. Someone had been in my house. While I slept, while I lay frozen in fear. They'd crept in and moved things, subtle shifts that made me doubt my own mind. I called the cops. They took a report, looked around. But there was no sign of break-in, no fingerprints. They gave me a card for a therapist and left with sympathetic looks. I took a day off work, too shaken to face the office. Spent it combing every inch of the house for anything else out of place. Checking and rechecking the locks. When night came, I was wound tighter than a screw. I sat in the dark living room, clutching a baseball bat, eyes glued to the window. The light came on next door, right on cue. But this time, it stayed on. No flicker, no wavering. A steady, taunting glow. I don't know what possessed me then. Fear, anger, some desperate need to confront this invader of my peace. But I found myself marching back across the lawn, that in hand, jaw clenched. This time, I didn't hesitate. I barged through the front door, flipped on the lights, and stopped dead. It was my house, down to the last detail. My furniture, my decor, my clutter. Like I'd stepped through a mirror into a perfect copy. But it wasn't quite perfect. There were small things, niggling wrongnesses. The couch slightly askew. A book upside down on the shelf. My high school trophy an inch too far to the left. And there at the window a figure. Back turned to me, face hidden. But I knew that silhouette, that stance. It was me. I must have made a noise then, a whimper or gasp. Because it turned, slowly, leisurely. And I was looking into my own face. but not quite my face. The features were right, but the expression was all wrong. A smile that was more snarl, eyes that glittered blankly in the harsh light. It lifted a hand, my hand, and waved. A jaunty, mocking gesture. I ran then. Ran like the devil himself was on my heels. Crashed through my own front door, slammed every lock, raced to the bathroom in time to heave my guts into the toilet. Spent the rest of the night curled on the tile, shaking, mind spinning useless circles, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light, a hallucination, a waking nightmare. But I knew, deep in my bones, that it was real. As real as the goose flesh on my arms, the sour taste of bile in my mouth. I called in sick the next day, and the next, jumped at every shadow, every reflection in the corner of my eye. I was losing my mind, and I knew it. On the third day, I made myself look out the window. In the cold light of day, the house next door looked as empty as ever. No lights, no movement. Like it had never happened. I almost began to relax. Almost let myself believe it really had been all in my head. Until the doorbell rang. I crept to the peephole, hand white-knuckled on the bat, peered through to the porch beyond. There was no one there, but there was something. A package, innocuous brown paper. No postmark, no return address. With trembling fingers, I undid the wrapping, lifted the lid of the box beneath. Inside was a single item, a picture frame, one of those cheap drugstore ones. And in the frame, a photo of me, asleep in my bed, covers tucked up to my chin, peaceful, vulnerable, and reflected in the bedroom window behind me, a face. My face, smiling that same snarling smile. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that photo, feeling my sanity unravel like a cheap sweater. But when I finally looked up, finally managed to tear my eyes from that horrific image, I saw it. In the window of the house next door, a figure, watching me, waving, wearing my face like a mask. I fled that day, left everything behind, got in my car and just drove. I haven't stopped driving since. Every town, every motel, I see that face in the window. My face, I don't know what it is, what it wants. I just know I can't go home again because it's waiting for me, wearing my stolen skin. Hashtag going down. I was the last one in the office as usual, burning the midnight oil, trying to get ahead, or maybe just avoiding going back to an empty apartment. I rubbed my eyes, gritty from staring at the screen for too long. The numbers were starting to blur together. Time to call it a night. I shut down my computer, gathered my things. The hallway was eerily quiet, the motion sensor lights flickering on as I walked, like I was being spotlit on a stage. I stabbed the elevator button, stifling a yawn. Checked my watch. 11:47 p.m. Way past my bedtime. The elevator dinged and the doors slid open. I stepped inside, fumbling for the ground floor button. But my finger froze halfway there. The panel was wrong. Where there should have been a neat row of numbers, there was a jumble of strange symbols, hieroglyphs or some alien language. And at the very bottom, a single button glowed red. I blinked, shook my head. I must be more tired than I thought, seeing things. But when I looked again, the panel was the same. Foreign, unsettling. Against my better judgment, I pressed the red button. The doors slid closed and the elevator began to descend. But it didn't stop at the ground floor. It kept going down, down, the numbers ticking past in a blur. G, B1, B2, B3. We didn't have a B3. The building only had 2 basement levels, I was sure of it. But still, we descended. My heart began to race, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. Something was very wrong here. I jabbed at the buttons, trying to get the elevator to stop. But they were unresponsive, the symbols seeming to writhe and twist under my fingers. The elevator shuddered to a halt. The doors opened with a soft ding that seemed obscene in the tense silence. Beyond was a hallway, long and dark. The walls were rough concrete, the floor bare dirt. Exposed pipes ran along the ceiling, dripping with moisture. The air smelled dank, ancient. This wasn't my building. Couldn't be. But the elevator doors stayed open, waiting. Inviting. I should have stayed put. Should have hammered on the door until anyone, came to my aid. But some morbid curiosity pulled me forward, out of the relative safety of the elevator. The moment my feet touched the dirt, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun, stabbing at the call button. But the elevator was gone, the wall solid and unbroken. No way back, only forward into the waiting dark. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, hands shaking as I turned on the flashlight. The beam was thin, wavering, barely penetrating the gloom. I chose a direction at random and started walking. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning at odd intervals. The dripping of the pipes was the only sound, echoing strangely off the close walls. Time lost meaning in that place. I might have walked for minutes or hours or days. My feet ached, my throat was parched with fear. But still I walked. There were doors set into the walls at irregular intervals. Heavy rusted metal with no markings. I tried a few, but they were all locked. Or perhaps welded shut from the other side. I began to hear things in the darkness. Whispers, skittering. The sounds of something ancient and hungry, biding its time. I told myself it was just rats or the wind whistling through the pipes. But the sounds followed me, always just at the edge of hearing. I walked faster, breath coming in ragged gasps. The beam of my phone jumped and danced ahead of me, casting twisted shadows on the walls. And then ahead a light. Not the sickly green glow of an emergency exit, but a warm, flickering orange, like a campfire or a torch. I stumbled towards it, half sobbing with relief. But as I drew closer, I began to make out details in the wavering light. And my relief turned to horror. It was a chamber rough-hewn from the stone. And in the center, a throne made of bones. Human bones, yellowed with age, arranged in a macabre parody of furniture. And on the throne, a figure, hunched and withered, swathed in rotting robes. As I watched, frozen with terror, it raised its head. And I saw its face. Or rather, its lack of a face. Where features should have been, there was only a smooth, hollow void. A darkness deeper than the tunnel, deeper than the night. It raised a hand, skeletal fingers beckoning. And I felt a tug, a pull at the very core of my being, drawing me forward towards that awful throne. I tried to resist, to turn and run. But my body wouldn't obey. My feet moved of their own accord, dragging me step by step towards the waiting figure. As I drew closer, I saw other shapes in the shadows. Huddled forms, rocking and moaning. Their faces were familiar in a distant way. The receptionist from the third floor. The janitor who always worked the night shift. A dozen others I passed every day without truly seeing. Their eyes were hollow, their expressions blank. As if something essential had been scooped out of them, leaving only empty shells behind. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure on the throne loomed over me, its darkness enveloping me. I felt a cold touch on my forehead, icy fingers probing, pulling. I woke with a start, face pressed against the elevator doors. Slowly, I sat up, blinking in the harsh fluorescent light. I was back in my building on the ground floor. The elevator panel was back to normal, numbered buttons gleaming. A dream, then. A nightmare born of too much stress and too little sleep. I laughed shakily, running a hand over my face. But as I stepped out of the elevator, something crunched under my shoe. I looked down. Dirt. A fine layer of it clinging to the soles of my shoes. And caught in the treads, something white and splintered. A shard of bone. I haven't taken the elevator since that night. I take the stairs, all 12 flights, every day. And sometimes, passing the elevator doors, I swear I can hear it. The dripping of pipes, the skittering of claws, the whispers of something ancient and patient, waiting in the dark, waiting for me to descend once more, into the depths. #no trespassing. I was lost. No shame in admitting it. These back roads all looked the same after a while, endless stretches of trees and telephone poles, occasionally broken up by a rusted mailbox or a half-collapsed barn. I'd been driving for hours, ever since I stormed out of my ex's place with a hastily packed suitcase and a wounded pride. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just needed to get away, put some distance between me and my problems. But now, with the sun dipping below the horizon and my gas gauge inching towards empty, I was starting to regret my impulsive decision. I hadn't seen a gas station or even another car for miles. My cell phone had no signal out here in the boonies. I was considering just pulling over and trying to sleep in the car when I saw it. A light in the distance, warm and inviting. As I got closer, I could make out the shape of a house, set back from the road at the end of a long, winding driveway. It was an old farmhouse, paint peeling and shingles missing. But there was a light on in the downstairs window and a curl of smoke rising from the chimney. It looked cozy, welcoming. I turned down the driveway without really thinking about it. I'd ask to use their phone, maybe beg a cup of coffee and directions to the nearest town. Surely they wouldn't mind helping out a lost traveler. The driveway was longer than I expected. The house seemed to recede into the distance as I drove, always just out of reach. The trees pressed close on either side, their branches scraping against the car like grasping fingers. After what felt like an eternity, I finally reached the end of the driveway. I parked the car and stepped out, shivering in the sudden chill. The house loomed before me, suddenly less inviting than it had appeared from the road. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn tight. No sign of the warm light I had seen. I walked up the creaking steps to the front porch. Up close, I could see the extent of the house's disrepair, the rotting boards, the rusted hinges on the door. It looked abandoned, derelict. But I was here now, and I needed help. I raised my hand and knocked, the sound echoing hollowly in the silence. No answer. I knocked again, harder. The door swung inward under my touch, creaking on its hinges. "Hello?" I called out, stepping into the foyer. "Is anyone home?" "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm lost and I was hoping dash." My voice died in my throat. The interior of the house was in shambles, furniture overturned, wallpaper hanging in strips, debris strewn across the floor. It looked like it had been ransacked or abandoned in a hurry. And the smell, a thick, cloying odor of decay and neglect. It made my gorge rise. I took a step back, ready to flee back to the safety of my car. But something caught my eye, a flicker of movement in the shadows at the top of the stairs. "Hello?" I called again, my voice trembling. "I don't mean to intrude. I just need to use your phone." A shadow detached itself from the darkness and began to descend the stairs. Slowly, deliberately. The floorboards creaked under its weight. As it stepped into the dim light of the foyer, I saw that it was a woman. At least, I thought it was a woman. She wore a long, old-fashioned dress, the kind with a high collar and puffy sleeves. But the fabric was stained and tattered, hanging off her frame in moldering strips. Her skin was pale, almost translucent. I could see the blue veins mapping their way across her face and hands. Her hair hung in lank, greasy strands around her face. But it was her eyes that truly frightened me. They were sunken deep into their sockets, surrounded by dark, bruised flesh. And they were completely, utterly black. No whites, no irises. Just endless, fathomless pits of darkness. She opened her mouth and let out a low, keening moan. The sound seemed to echo in the confines of my skull, reverberating through my bones. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet in my haste to get away. I turned and ran, bursting out of the house and down the porch steps. I could hear that terrible moaning following me, growing louder, closer. I leapt into my car, fumbling with the keys. The engine sputtered and died, refusing to turn over. I pumped the gas, muttering desperate prayers under my breath. In the rearview mirror, I could see the woman, the thing, stumbling down the driveway towards me, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its black eyes seemed to bore into me, even from this distance. The engine finally caught, roaring to life. I slammed the car into reverse, tires squealing as I peeled out of the driveway. I didn't dare look back, didn't dare to see if it was still following me. I drove for miles until the sun started to rise and I began to recognize my surroundings again. I was almost convinced that it had all been a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and stress. But when I pulled into a gas station to fill up, I happened to glance in the back seat. There, Nestled among my hastily packed belongings was a scrap of fabric, a tattered, stained piece of an old-fashioned dress. I don't know how it got there. I don't want to know. I used a wad of napkins from the glove box to gingerly pick it up and toss it in the station's trash can. I haven't been back to that area since. I take the highway now, even if it adds hours to my trip. I don't even like driving at night anymore, because every time I close my eyes, I see that house. That driveway that stretched on forever, leading to a place that shouldn't exist. And those eyes, those terrible, black eyes staring into my soul. I've tried to convince myself that it wasn't real, that it was just a nightmare, a product of my overtired mind. But deep down, I know the truth. I know that if I went back, if I followed that long, winding driveway through the endless night, it would be there, waiting for me, the unreachable house, and its undying occupant. Hashtag knock knock. Being a single mom is hard. Don't let anyone tell you different. It's a constant juggling act. Work, childcare, bills, housework. There's no one to share the load, no one to hand off to when you're at your wit's end. But I was managing. I had to for Liam's sake. He was my world, my reason for getting up in the morning. At 6 years old, he was all smiles and boundless energy, always eager to show me his latest drawing or tell me about his adventures on the playground. We had a routine: dinner, playtime, bath, story, bed. I cherished those quiet moments before he drifted off to sleep, when I could just sit and watch him, marveling at this perfect little being I had created. It was during one of those peaceful interludes that I first heard it. A soft tapping at the window, barely audible over the sound of Liam's gentle breathing. I dismissed it at first. Must be a branch blowing in the wind, I thought. But it came again the next night, and the next. Always the same gentle tapping, like fingernails on glass. Always at the same time, just as Liam was drifting off to sleep. I tried to ignore it. Told myself it was just the house settling, or maybe a bird pecking at the windowsill. But a part of me, the part that jolts awake at every creak and groan in the night, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. On the fourth night, I couldn't take it anymore. I crept to the window, hard in my throat, and peered out into the darkness. At first I saw nothing, just the shadowy outlines of trees, the pale gleam of moonlight on the grass. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something else. A shape huddled in the bushes beneath the window. It was a man. At least, I thought it was a man. He was dressed all in black, his face hidden in the shadows. He was crouching, as if trying to stay out of sight, but I could feel his eyes on me, boring into me through the glass. I stumbled back from the window, a scream lodged in my throat. I wanted to run, to grab Liam and flee, but I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. By the time I found my voice, he was gone, melted back into the shadows like he had never been there at all. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up in bed, clutching a baseball bat, jumping at every noise. I kept the lights on, afraid of what might be lurking in the darkness. The next day, I called the police. They sent an officer out to take a statement, but I could tell he didn't believe me. Just a single mom, jumping at shadows, he probably thought. He promised to increase patrols in the area and left me with a card for victim support services. I tried to put it out of my mind. Told myself it was just a figment of my overtired imagination. But every night as darkness fell, the fear crept back in. I started seeing him everywhere. A glimpse of a dark figure out of the corner of my eye. A shadow lurking in the background of Liam's school photos. Always just at the edge of my vision, never quite in focus. I knew I was unraveling, losing my grip on reality. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Being stalked by something I couldn't see or understand. Then the gifts started appearing. I found the first one on the porch, just outside the front door. A small, crudely carved wooden figurine, like a child's toy. It looked like Liam, down to the cowlick in his hair and the gap in his front teeth. I told myself it was just a coincidence, that some neighborhood kid had left it there as a prank. But deep down, I knew better. The next one appeared in Liam's bedroom, propped up on his pillow. This one was more detailed, painted in garish colors. Its eyes seemed to follow me as I moved around the room. I threw it away, along with the first one. But they kept coming. Toys, dolls, little effigies that looked just like my son. I found them in the car, in my purse, even in the pockets of my coat. I stopped sleeping altogether, started jumping at my own shadow. I knew I needed help, but who would believe me? I was a single mom under a lot of stress. It would be all too easy to write me off as paranoid, delusional. The police couldn't do anything without proof. And what proof did I have? A few creepy dolls and a shadow in the bushes? I'd sound crazy even to myself. So I kept quiet, installed new locks, bought a security system I couldn't afford, told Liam that the dolls were just a game, that he shouldn't touch them or talk about them. But I could see the toll it was taking on him. He had nightmares, woke up crying in the night. He started drawing pictures of the shadowy figure over and over again until the pages were black with crayon. And all the while, the tapping continued. Every night, just as Liam was falling asleep. Tap, tap, tap. Like a heartbeat. Like a clock ticking down to some inevitable end. Then, one night, it stopped. No tapping, no shadows, no dolls. Just silence, stretching out into the darkness. I should have been relieved. But instead, a cold dread settled into the pit of my stomach. Somehow I knew this was worse. That whatever had been stalking us, tormenting us, was done playing games. I heard a creak on the stairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps making their way up to the second floor. To Liam's room. I grabbed the bat with shaking hands and crept out into the hall. The footsteps had stopped, but I could see a shadow under Liam's door. A shadow that shouldn't be there. I eased the door open, that raised to strike. And there it was, the figure from the bushes, from the photos, standing over Liam's bed, looking down at his sleeping form. It turned to face me, and I saw its eyes, hollow, empty pits, blacker than the darkest night, and in its hand a long, gleaming knife. I don't remember what happened next. They say trauma can do that, blur the details. I have flashes, screaming, swinging the bat with all my strength, the sickening crunch of impact. Blood, black in the moonlight, splattered across the walls, the floor, my hands. They didn't find a body, just a trail of dark, viscous liquid leading out the shattered window and into the night. The police say there's no evidence anyone else was ever here, that the blood was mine, that I must have imagined the whole thing. But I know what I saw. And I know he's still out there, watching, waiting. The tapping has started again. Louder now, more insistent. It's not just at night anymore. I hear it during the day at work on the bus. Liam doesn't talk much anymore. Just sits and stares out the window, clutching one of those awful dolls. I don't know what it wants, what it will do when I can't protect my son anymore. All I know is that it's coming. And this time, I don't know if I'm strong enough to face what lurks in the shadows. Tap, tap, tap. Hashtag Final Destination. I've been driving a cab for 15 years. You see a lot in this line of work. Drunks, junkies, cheating spouses, the whole spectrum of human dysfunction. I thought I'd seen it all. Until that night. It was a slow shift, even for a Tuesday. The kind of night where you're just counting down the minutes until you can clock out and go home. I was parked outside the bus station, smoking a cigarette and listening to the dispatcher's chatter on the radio when she climbed in. I didn't even hear the door open. 1 minute I was alone. The next she was there, sitting in the back seat like she'd materialized out of thin air. I jumped, cigarette tumbling from my lips. Jesus, lady, you scared the shit out of me. She didn't respond. Just sat there, hands folded primly in her lap, staring straight ahead. She was old, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and a face lined with wrinkles. She wore a black dress that looked like it belonged in another century, high-collared and long-sleeved despite the summer heat. I twisted around in my seat, annoyance giving way to unease. Where to? She spoke then, her voice barely above a whisper. She gave an address I didn't recognize, somewhere on the outskirts of town. I shrugged and pulled out of the parking lot. A fare was a fare, even if the passenger gave me the creeps. We drove in silence. The old woman sat perfectly still, not even seeming to breathe. I kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror, but she never moved, never blinked. Just stared ahead with those pale, watery eyes. The address she'd given me took us out of the city, down winding roads that curved through dense woods. We passed the occasional farmhouse, a gas station, but mostly it was just trees, their branches reaching out to brush the car like grasping fingers. I was starting to get nervous. I'd been driving these roads for years, but I'd never been out this far. It felt like we were driving to the end of the world, or someplace even further. After what felt like hours, we turned down a narrow dirt road. Potholes jolted the car, branches scraping against the windows. The road seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning until I was completely turned around. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the road ended. We came to a clearing, an empty patch of dirt surrounded by towering trees. In the center of the clearing was a house. It was more of a shack, really. A ramshackle old structure that looked like it might collapse at any moment. The windows were boarded up, the roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. I put the car in park and turned to my passenger, a sinking feeling in my gut. "We're here." She didn't move, didn't even acknowledge that I'd spoken. Just kept staring straight ahead, eyes fixed on that decrepit old house. A chill ran down my spine. Something about this felt wrong, deeply wrong. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there, to leave this weird old lady and her creepy destination far behind. But I had a job to do. I cleared my throat, tried to keep my voice steady. "That'll be $32.50. No response. I twisted around in my seat, reaching back to tap her on the shoulder. "Ma'am, we've arrived." "That'll be dash." My words died in my throat. The back seat was empty. The old woman was gone, vanished as suddenly and silently as she'd appeared. I scrambled out of the car, heart pounding in my chest. I circled the cab, checking the doors, the trunk, even looking under the chassis. But there was no sign of her. It was like she had never been there at all. I looked back at the house, looming in the darkness. A single light burned in an upstairs window, dim and flickering like a candle. As I watched, a shadow passed behind the curtain, a silhouette, tall and thin, with long, spindly fingers. I jumped back in the car, fumbling with the keys. The engine sputtered and died, refusing to turn over. I pumped the gas, muttering curses under my breath, but it was no use. The car was dead. I was reaching for my phone when I heard it, a creak like a rusty hinge. I looked up to see the front door of the house slowly swinging open, a yawning black maw in the weathered wood. And there, standing in the doorway, was the old woman. She was smiling now, a ghastly, toothless grin that stretched her wrinkled face into a grotesque mask. She raised one gnarled hand, beckoning me. I could hear her voice in my head, a sibilant whisper that crawled through my thoughts like a centipede. Come inside. I've been waiting for you." I don't remember running. Don't remember stumbling through the woods, branches tearing at my clothes, my skin. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, until I collapsed on the side of a dirt road miles from that accursed house. A passing motorist found me there, curled up in the fetal position, babbling incoherently. They took me to the hospital, where I spent the next week sedated, drifting in and out of consciousness. When I was finally lucid enough to give a statement, the police went out to the location I described. But they found nothing. No house, no clearing, no dirt road. Just miles of uninterrupted forest. They chalked it up to hallucinations, a breakdown brought on by stress and overwork. I almost believed it myself. Almost convinced myself that it had all been a product of my overtired mind. But then, a month later, I got a call. It was the dispatcher from that night, her voice shaking with barely contained hysteria. "I don't know how," she said. "I don't know why, but that address, that woman, they've appeared in the system again. Another driver picked up the fare last night." I felt a chill run through me, a bone-deep coldness that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in my apartment. "What driver?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. There was a pause, a ragged breath. "That's just it," she said. "It's you. According to the log, you picked her up outside the bus station at 11:15 p.m. And then you disappeared. The GPS lost track of your car somewhere on the outskirts of town. We've been trying to reach you for hours. The phone fell from my numb fingers, clattered on the floor. I looked down at my hands and saw that they were shaking, trembling like dead leaves in the wind. I could feel it then, the weight of her gaze boring into the back of my head. The phantom chill of her presence like a cold hand on the back of my neck. She's here, in the car with me, even now. I can hear her breathing in the back seat, a dry, rattling sound like wind through dead branches. Waiting, always waiting, for me to take her home, to that final destination at the end of a road that doesn't exist. A road that leads to a house of shadows and secrets where a light burns eternally in an upstairs window. A road I know I will drive again, and again, and again, until the end of my days. Or maybe even beyond that. #shadow play. I should have known better than to go climbing alone. It's rule number 1 in the Mountaineer Handbook. Always bring a buddy, someone to watch your back. But I was cocky, confident in my skills and my gear. I tackled tougher peaks than this one, I told myself. I could handle a solo ascent. The first few hours went smoothly. I made good time, the familiar burn in my muscles a comforting reminder of my strength, my capability. The mountain was a challenge, but one I felt more than equal to. It was when I reached the first plateau that I heard it, a voice echoing across the rocky expanse. My voice calling out in a panicked, desperate tone I barely recognized. Help! Somebody help me! I froze, heart pounding in my chest. The voice sounded close, just around the bend of the trail. But that was impossible. I was alone on this mountain, miles from the nearest human being. I called out, my real voice shaky and uncertain. Hello? Is someone there? My only answer was my own echo, bouncing back to me off the stone walls. I shook my head, chalking it up to the thin mountain air playing tricks on my mind. I took a swig from my water bottle and pressed on, determined to reach the summit before nightfall. But the voice came again, louder this time. Please, I'm hurt. I can't move. It was definitely my voice. There was no mistaking it now. But it was coming from somewhere ahead of me, along the path I had yet to traverse. A chill ran down my spine. Was I losing my mind? Was the isolation, the exertion, causing me to hallucinate? I quickened my pace, eager to prove to myself that there was nothing there, that it was all in my head. But with every step, the voice grew louder, more insistent. Why won't you help me? Please, I'm scared. I broke into a run, scrambling over boulders and loose scree. The voice seemed to be coming from everywhere now, surrounding me, filling my head until I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I stumbled into a clearing and stopped dead. There, on the ground in front of me, was a body. My body, twisted and broken, limbs splayed at impossible angles. I stared, uncomprehending. This couldn't be real. It had to be a trick of the light, a mirage conjured by my oxygen-starved brain. But then the body moved. Its head lolled towards me, and I found myself staring into my own face. My eyes wide and terrified. My mouth opening in a scream of agony. Why did you let this happen? It whispered, blood bubbling from its lips. Why didn't you save me? I turned and ran, blind with panic. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. I just needed to get away from that thing, that horrible, impossible doppelganger. I ran until my lungs burned and my vision blurred. I ran until the path disappeared beneath my feet and I was scrambling through uncharted wilderness, jagged rocks tearing at my hands and knees. And all the while, the voice followed me. My voice taunting me, accusing me. You're going to die out here. Just like I did. Just like we always knew you would. I clapped my hands over my ears, trying to block it out. But it was inside my head now, echoing in the caverns of my skull. I don't know how long I ran, how far. Time lost all meaning in that nightmare landscape. All I know is that when I finally collapsed, when my legs gave out and I tumbled to the hard ground, I was somewhere I had never been before. A narrow canyon, walls of sheer rock rising on either side. No path, no sign of human passage. Just the wind, whistling through the stone like the breath of some great, unseen beast. And there, in the center of the canyon, a shadow. A silhouette, tall and gaunt, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to twist and writhe in the flickering light. I scrambled backwards, my heart in my throat. The shadow turned, and I saw its face. Or rather, its lack of a face. Where features should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless void. A darkness deeper than the blackest night. It took a step towards me, its movements jerky and unnatural. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was frozen, paralyzed by a terror more profound than anything I had ever known. It reached for me, those long, twisted fingers grasping at the air. And as it did, it spoke. "You can't escape yourself," it said, and its voice was my voice, echoing from the depths of that awful blankness. "You cannot run what you are." I closed my eyes, waiting for the touch of those horrible hands, waiting for the end. But it never came. When I opened my eyes, the shadow was gone. The canyon was empty, silent but for the moaning of the wind. I lay there for a long time, shaking, too terrified to move. When I finally managed to stand, to take a faltering step, I saw them. Footprints in the dust. My footprints leading into the canyon, but not leading out. I followed them, stumbling, half crawling at times. They led me deeper and deeper into the labyrinth of stone, twisting and turning until I was hopelessly lost. And then, just when I thought I could go no further, I saw it. Light up ahead. The mouth of the canyon, opening onto a familiar vista. The first plateau. The spot where I had first heard the voice. I staggered out into the open, blinking in the sudden glare of the sun. My pack, my gear, lay where I had left it, undisturbed. But there, next to it, another set of footprints, larger, deeper, leading off into the wilderness, towards the distant peak. I didn't follow them. I turned, and I began the long, painful descent back to civilization, back to safety. But I know it's still out there. The shadow, the echo, my own personal demon, born from the depths of my darkest fears. I see it sometimes in the corner of my eye, hear its whisper on the wind. It's waiting for me, I know, waiting for me to return to the mountain, to that place where reality bends and nightmares come to life. And sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, I almost want to go, to confront it, to face the twisted reflection of myself that lurks in the shadows of my mind. But I know I never will, because in the end, there are some summits that are too high, some abysses too deep, and some echoes that never fade, no matter how far you run.